All right, it's 6:05, so we'll get started. Thank you all for bearing with us through that awkward silence that happens at the beginning of every virtual meeting while we're waiting to kick off. I'm Lisa Gavoni. I'm co-leading the 2024 update of the Growth and Infrastructure Policy with Darcy Buckley. We have our whole team here tonight. We have David Ansbacher, who is the acting chief for the Countywide Planning and Policy Division, Eli Glazier, who is the acting transportation supervisor for Countywide Planning and Policy, Jesus Beck, who is our adequate public facilities planner, and Caleb Prendergast, who is our graduate intern for the year, helping us out on the growth and infrastructure policy. So Darcy, if you can go to the next slide. So today, my colleagues and I were going to present planning staff's preliminary recommendations for the county's growth and infrastructure 2024 update, which includes recommendations for schools, transportation, impact taxes. And I really want to emphasize that these are preliminary recommendations. We're working through a lot of these. For all of these, we're still brainstorming and talking to the executive branch agencies, the communities. We want to hear your feedback tonight, as well as the municipalities and really anyone who has a vested stake in the growth and infrastructure policy. We're continually trying to improve this policy. So just a brief agenda, because we have a lot to get through. We're going to briefly talk about what the growth and infrastructure policy is, go through what we're looking at in the 2024 update, dive into the preliminary recommendations, and talk about next steps. And then we want to discuss any questions that you may have regarding the policy. Next slide. So just to briefly introduce the growth and infrastructure policy, the foundation of the growth and infrastructure policy is that we must have adequate infrastructure to support growth. Every 4 years, planners update the growth and infrastructure policy, or the GIP as we call it, to ensure the best available tools are in place to test whether infrastructure like schools, transportation, water and sewer services can support a proposed development. But it's so much more than that. It's a policy that can help advance county priorities like housing for all, safety, and racial equity and social justice, which is an element of the policy that Darcy will touch on later. Today, we're going to walk through some of our preliminary recommendations, which will serve as the groundwork for our recommendations that we're going to work through this summer with the Planning Board and preparation of transmittal of the Planning Board draft of the GIP by August 1st. And like I said, please remember these recommendations are a work in progress. Next slide. You can go back one slide. So the adequate public facilities regulations state that the planning board may only approve a proposed development after determining that the surrounding infrastructure, such as sidewalks, roads, and schools, can meet the needs of new residents, visitors, and students. The county's APF includes transportation, schools, water, sewer, police, fire, and health services. And the GIP guides how the planning board makes the determination by setting standards for evaluating public infrastructure and the impact an individual development may have on it. It also outlines how a developer can bring infrastructure up to standards so the project can proceed. And making an adequacy determination involves both predicting future demand from private development and assessing the condition of existing public infrastructure. The council adopted GIP establishes the broad rules for defining adequacy, and the GIP is then implemented through subject-specific guidelines approved by the planning board. The annual school test, which Jesus will elaborate on later, evaluates the projected capacity utilization of the county's K through 12 public school facilities. It establishes an adequacy status for each school service area as the growth and infrastructure policy prescribes. And the results of the test are certified by the planning board each June to be effective for the upcoming fiscal year and then used to determine the appropriate conditions of approval during development review. Local Area Transportation Review, or LATR guidelines, they detail the rules and procedures for completing the transportation adequacy test, which Darcy will talk more about later.
So these are our general 2024 update themes, kind of the big buckets that we've been working on. The first is to review the performance of the 2020 through 24 growth and infrastructure policy. Also to consider the county's current growth context, and how they might have changed and what we're predicting for the future. And making recommendations with the goal of making policy implementation clearer and more efficient. We've also reviewed and made recommendations on development impact taxes. While these aren't technically part of the policy itself, they are really closely connected. So planning typically reviews them at the same time as it updates the policy. And last but not least, we've worked to align the policy with updated county priorities and goals. Since the 2021 policy update, the county has adopted several landmark plans and policies, such as our new general plan, Thrive Montgomery 2050, the Climate Action Plan, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, and the Vision Zero Action Plan. We've strived to ensure our recommendations align with the goals identified in those plans. Those priorities specifically are racial equity and social justice, economic competitiveness, environmental resilience, compact growth, housing for all, safety, and of course, good governance. Our preliminary recommendations, which we're sharing tonight, overall, they ensure adequacy while improving development conditions in the county. And we're doing that by enhancing the predictability, transparency, and proportionality in the approval process while supporting the county's goals and priorities.
Hi, I'm Jesus Beck. I'm the Adequate Public Facilities Planner with a main focus on school infrastructure. So I'll be going over the preliminary recommendations we have for the schools element of the policy. Next slide, please. So for schools, the 2020 GIP update introduced school impact areas. So the tools that are employed by the policy, like student generation rates and impact tax rates, can be applied to in a context-sensitive way. So areas where we are seeing housing growth mainly in the form of multifamily, which have lower impact on enrollment on a per unit basis, were classified as infill impact areas. In areas where residential patterns are already established and enrollment trends are mostly affected by the turnover of existing units, were classified as turnover impact areas. We also classified areas seeing large growth in single family units where new development has a high impact on enrollment as greenfield impact areas. But during the 2020 update, the council decided that we should also include future residential capacity as a factor for analysis. So no area of the county was found to be greenfield back then. So the map on the right here shows how the county is classified now. One issue about these school impact areas, as they are currently, is that they're adding another boundary to an already complex layers of geographies to understand the full implications of this policy. So if you go to the next slide, for this update round, we're recommending to modifying the school impact area boundaries so that they could align with the proposed transportation policy area boundaries, which Darcy will explain in detail later. But using an educated guess, we're expecting that the red transportation policy areas will most likely be classified as infill impact areas, but we're awaiting a more updated and detailed analysis of each of these areas with the new boundaries to decide to identify which areas will be classified as which using their latest housing context and growth potentials. Next slide, please. Now, the annual school test is how the county evaluates the adequacy of each school. The planning department uses MCPS's enrollment and capacity projection data for 4 years out in the future, incorporating scheduled capacity relief plans, and places each school service area into different levels of utilization premium payment, UPP tiers, according to their program capacity utilization rate, which is enrollment divided by capacity, and seat deficits, which is enrollment subtracted from capacity. So the annual school test results are closely related to MCPS's CIP decisions. For example, MCPS will consider a classroom addition for an elementary school if it is expected to be 92 seats over capacity at the end of the 6-year CIP cycle, 150 seats if it's a middle school, and 200 for high schools. And these plans will show up in the data that we use for the annual school test. But currently, the points that the UPP payments are, the UPPs are triggered at, which are seen in the black text of the vertical axis on the graph here, don't neatly align with the MCPS thresholds that they use for the CIP. So our recommendation for this round is to adjust the numbers to what's shown in blue instead, which means that a tier 1 UPP at the bottom will be triggered when a school seat deficit is projected to be over 80% of the MCPS's threshold and the utilization rate exceeds 105%. And then when a school seat deficit reaches MCPS's exact threshold with a utilization rate over 120%, a tier 2 UPP will be triggered. And then when the seat deficit exceeds 120% of MCPS's threshold, which actually aligns with the previous moratorium thresholds that we had for elementary schools and middle schools, and the utilization rate is over 135%, then those school service areas will be placed in a tier 3 UPP. Next slide, please. So these utilization premium payments, if we explain a little more, are a mitigation tool that was introduced in the last GIP update to replace the moratorium, which was proving to be dysfunctional in many ways. So now when a developer proposes to build in a school service area that's deemed inadequate, they are assessed a surcharge on top of their impact tax. These are assessed as a condition of approval for preliminary plans, but not collected until the project reaches permitting stage. Over the past 4 years since we've introduced these UPPs, the planning department has assessed various levels of UPPs on over 1,200 residential units across the county in 8 different school service areas. So far, though, the county has only collected the UPP for one of those units. But if all these projects were to pull permits today, hypothetically, the total funds that could be collected would be over $4.75 million. When it comes to how we can use those funds, though, there's one limitation. Because these UPPs are a fee and not a tax, there must be a rational nexus. Currently, that nexus is interpreted as projects that add capacity to alleviate the school service area from which the funds were collected for. So staff is recommending to modify that language so that UPP funds can be used for capacity additions at adjacent schools or clusters as well, even though there might not be an intention described to relieve adjacent schools. For example, 4 of the high school service areas that UPP funds were assessed for in the past are expected to be relieved through Crown High School, which is scheduled to open in 2027. Wooten High School, which currently has surplus capacity, will also be included in the Crown boundary change and can potentially relieve some of those schools with its surplus capacity. Furthermore, it's also expecting a major capital project that will increase its capacity even more a few years after the Crown High School opening year. But under the current policy, the funds that were collected for those 4 high schools that could be used for Crown High School can't be used for Wooten High School. With this recommended change, though, the UPP from those 4 high schools can be used for Wooten, especially if the funds weren't collected in time to be used for Crown. Next slide, please. So the last few recommendations for schools have to do with student generation rates, which refer to the average number of students generated from a housing unit. Many jurisdictions actually rely on student generation rate estimates from samples, but in our county, we calculate the actual student generation rates using real and whole data provided by MCPS and the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. The official SGR student generation rates, also I'll be calling as SGRs, are calculated every other year and used for estimating the enrollment impact of a development application and calculating school impact tax rates. Currently, we classify all residential units into 4 categories, either single-family detached, single-family attached, multifamily low-rise, and multifamily high-rise. There was some discussion during the last policy update on whether it makes sense to keep distinguishing between multifamily low-rise and high-rise structures. But because there was a discernible difference between the student generation rates of the 2, we decided to keep the distinction. The latest SGR rate analysis for this year, for the latest year, that we have shows that there's still a big difference between these two structures. So we're recommending to keep the distinction as it is. A different type of challenge that we're seeing now and expect to see more is housing units that deviate from the typical single family and multifamily classifications. For example, stacked flats, also called 2/2s, are currently categorized as multifamily low-rise by our zoning standards and student generation rate purposes, but they're often marketed and perceived as townhouses. So we did a preliminary review of the units that we were able to identify from our data set, and the results indicate that their student generation rates are pretty different from the typical low-rise apartments. So we're recommending adding an additional housing category into our student generation rates housing types for these types of alternative units. We'll first start out this category by separating stacked flats from multifamily low-rise. And then as the attainable housing strategies initiatives move forward, we'll keep evaluating whether a certain type of unit will have to be included in this category or not. Next slide, please. The next recommendation is about how we calculate multifamily student generation rates. As many might know, apartments have been evolving throughout the decades, and newer developments tend to produce units that are smaller in square footage and bedroom count, but higher in cost, and are overall presenting as different typologies from their predecessors. During the last policy updates, we found that multifamily units in structures built in 1990 or later were showing significantly lower student generation rates than those built in earlier decades. So the question was, would that 1990 delineator for the structures hold when we redo the analysis later, which we did this time around. And as shown on the graph on the right here, the 1990 mark still seems to hold. So we're planning to continue. Our recommendation is to continue to calculate multifamily student generation rates based on data from structures built in the 1990s or later only. Next slide, please. The last recommendation has to do with the potential implications of the blueprint for Maryland's future, which passed in 2021 to transform public education in the state. As a result of this legislation, MCPS is charged with expanding its early childhood education services for families earning incomes at or below 300% federal poverty level. There are currently over 2,800 students enrolled in MCPS's pre-kindergarten or Head Start programs across 70 of the 137 elementary schools. And as you can see here, by 2029, that number is projected to be above 4,000, which is about 40% of other school grade levels. So currently, MCPS's projections include these enrollments, which means they're captured in the annual school test adequacy evaluations at the planning department, but they're not included in official student generation rate calculations. Right now, it's unclear when these efforts will be fully implemented, and also how much of the demand will fall on MCPS, because the blueprint also grants access to income qualifying families to private providers. So at this point, we're recommending just monitoring the preschool enrollment as it rolls out. So once the enrollment reaches a level, as we monitor, once the enrollment reaches a level equivalent to that of other grade levels, we'll consider including it in the official student generation rate calculations, so their impact is accounted for by development applications. So that's the end of the school's preliminary recommendations. And next, Darcy will explain the transportation side.
Great, thank you. So previous updates of the transportation element of the growth and infrastructure policy have moved the policy away from strategies that were exclusively concerned with reducing congestion and towards ones that really make walking, biking, and transit safer and more convenient. For example, the 2016 update introduced a context-driven framework for transportation improvements in the form of our policy areas. And the 2020 update expanded adequacy to really include and focus on safety, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit systems. Our recommendations for 2024 really focus on continuing this trend while honing our existing tools. It's important to remember that the growth and infrastructure policy only deals with off-site improvements. These are conditions and infrastructure beyond the limits of a proposed development. It doesn't include the frontage, which in this image are those areas marked in red, nor does it include access or circulation within the site itself. Any project that's projected to have 50 or more new trips need to perform a multimodal study or test of the surrounding area. They identify what's deficient or lacking, and then work with staff to develop a refined list of projects to complete. These selected projects or improvements become part of the plan approval. In this case, the applicant was required to construct 3 different segments of side path, improve 2 crossings, and bring 4 curb ramps into compliance with the American Disabilities Act. Looking at LATR as a whole, we've had 17 project plans have been approved that included LATR mitigation since June 2021, meaning that they reflect the policy changes that were made in the 2020 GIP update. This table summarizes the required offsite improvements that were in those plans, and it kind of gives you a sense of what our priorities have been in terms of asking developments to construct things or improve transportation infrastructure. For example, our focus here, you can see, has really been on bike lanes, side paths, and sidewalks, as well as curb ramps and bus stops, rather than a capacity improvement to, say, widen a road. We haven't required that, except in one case where a turn lane was added. So as we move forward, keep in mind that these LATR requirements are in addition to all the other requirements in our code, and that they only apply to a small number of projects compared to the hundreds of plans that the board has approved in the same time frame. The GIP defines context-based geographies known as transportation policy areas. They're a really important tool in the county's effort to concentrate growth along the corridors and in centers of activity. Today, we have 42 different policy areas, and they're categorized into one of 4 colors based on current and future transportation land use context. The policy colors do a few different things. One, they determine adequacy thresholds for the test that we'll talk about in a minute. They also importantly determine impact tax rates, as well as requirements for transportation demand management. Red is our central business districts. These are typically characterized by higher density development and the existence of premium transit. Orange areas are corridor cities and town centers with planned premium transit, and the yellow areas have a lower density areas, primarily residential with community serving commercial areas. And last but not least, the green areas in our agricultural reserve and rural areas. We've made recommendations to update both the boundaries of the policy, some of the policy areas, as well as their categorization to reflect existing conditions and to align with the vision for future development that is seen in our area and functional master plans, such as the Master Plan of Highways, as well as Thrive Montgomery 2050. First recommendation is we've recommended establishing 3 new red policy areas in the Great Seneca Life Sciences area, the FDA Village in White Oak, and in Rock Spring. We've also recommended expanding the orange policy areas to cover areas such as Germantown, Montgomery Village, part of Clarksburg, as well as the Aspen Hill area around surrounding Georgia Avenue, and the Fairland area near US 29. We've also recommended making Damascus a yellow policy area. Although it's certainly not a downtown, it is an established residential community where some growth is both existing and also desirable. So we want to have that be reflected in our policy areas as well. The following recommendations pertain to the technical aspects of what we call our local area transportation review transportation test. Our goal with these recommendations is to maintain our high standards while, when possible, reducing the amount of unnecessary data collection and analysis that we're requiring. The following recommendations simplify the policy, making it more effective, transparent, and predictable. Applicants that have 50 or more new trips have to go through these tests or studies for different modes. They all do motor vehicle, pedestrian, bicycle, and bus transit system tests. Our first recommendation really deals with that threshold of 50 trips and also more generally how we measure impact. The 2016 growth policy update introduced person trips, which became the base metric for measuring impact. Person trips are a trip by one person in any mode of transportation. It replaced what we'd used for decades before, which is the motor vehicle metric. So with person trips, you're counting people instead of cars. And today, they serve as the threshold for conducting a study and for determining the size of the study area. We found over the past few years that using this metric to assess the development impact is somewhat problematic because it weighs pedestrian trips and vehicle trips equally. This means if there's a development generating 50 pedestrian trips, it's held to the same requirements as one that's generating 50 vehicle trips, even though the one with the vehicle trips has a much more significant negative impact on both on the transportation system as well as on the environment and other safety. Treating pedestrian, bicycle, and transit trips as impacts that need to be mitigated rather than outcomes that we should encourage is also inconsistent with the goals of Thrive Montgomery 2050. So we're recommending replacing the person trip metric with a vehicle trip metric and returning to that instead to measure impacts. The pedestrian test has three components: the pedestrian level of comfort, the illuminance and streetlight standards, and American Disabilities Act compliance. This is the most kind of intense of all the tests, as it requires a lot of field work and taking measurements in the field and studying existing conditions. Our recommendation is to standardize the study area across policy areas. Doing this will reduce the burden that the higher burden right now that's put on our red and orange policy areas. Under the current policy, they have a bigger study area than the yellow and green ones. So we're recommending standardizing it so that everyone uses the same policy area, which is the smaller one currently set by yellow and green. Our recommendation for the bicycle adequacy test is quite similar, but in this case, we're looking to expand the study area so that we have larger study areas in our yellow and green areas. And this is because, well, one, the bicycle test is a much easier test to conduct. It requires like less on the ground work, but also in order to make meaningful bicycle facilities, you need to look at larger areas. So that's our recommendation for that. For the bus transit adequacy test, the current test asks applicants to evaluate bus stops for shelters, displays, amenities, and an accessible path, and green policy areas are exempt. We are recommending that we removing the green policy exemption. And rather than listing all of the different amenities that need to be at a stop, to instead refer them to MCDOT guidelines. These guidelines don't exist yet, but when they are available, they will be provided to applicants so that it's very clear about what applicants need to provide. Finally, all projects with LATR studies develop a Vision Zero statement assessing and proposing solutions to high injury network locations and related safety issues. For this statement, applicants collect and analyze a really substantial amount of data, but they really have very limited opportunities to act on it because potential solutions like a road diet or a speed limit change aren't usually within their control. So we are recommending to kind of refine the requirements of this one, so really to focus on speed. We're also recommending that we remove the safe systems adequacy placeholder. This is a placeholder test that doesn't have any content in it in the current policy. That was put in there for a future test in 2020. But since 2020, the county design guidance, like Complete Streets Design Guide and other related county code updates, now those really provide appropriate direction for private development. So we're recommending removing this placeholder. After completing those previous tests and studies, a developer has an inventory of substandard infrastructure surrounding their site. As you might imagine, the list of potential improvements can be pretty long and pretty expensive. So this recommendation gets at, how much of that list or how many items the county can require the applicant to do. Long-standing federal case law says that requirements can't be excessive, and they need to be closely related and roughly proportional to the development's impact. So the planning board introduced what we call the proportionality guide in 2020, at the time really as a temporary measure to address concerns about disproportionate and unpredictable mitigation costs. The bucket of potential projects really went up after the 2020 policy update because now all projects have to do all the pedestrian, bike, and transit tests. So while this calculation has made costs more predictable, it continues to generate potentially disproportionate and possibly excessive costs for some projects, and it needs further evaluation. So we are recommending developing a new calculation that better addresses proportionality as part of our LATR update. Rather than using the size of the development, which is what we currently do, the new calculation would use trips to calculate an upper limit of expected costs of mitigation. And it would be based on the land use and location as well as the trips. The county prefers that developers mitigate with physical improvements, meaning they actually construct a sidewalk, for example. When this isn't possible, the county will accept a fee in lieu, a cash payment in lieu of construction. These collected funds must be spent on similar improvements within the same policy area or in an adjacent one. The problem is that it's extremely difficult to track, budget, and spend small amounts of money attached to discrete areas. We recommend continuing to limit fee in lieu payments by encouraging developers to construct the improvements like sidewalks and crosswalks and only accepting payments in rare circumstances. When funds are collected, we recommend grouping the collected funds together so they can be spent in a more meaningful way. One option would be to group them and budget them like we do with impact taxes by policy area. Other options would be to create new capital improvement projects. There could be one for each policy area, or another option is to create an LATR participation fund that could be used to extend developer-built improvements within the same policy area. As a policy document, the GIP is a tool to further our county goals. One of the ways we can do this is by exempting certain desired uses from the requirements, which helps make them more financially viable. The current GIP exempts affordable housing from making payments in lieu of construction, the ones from the previous slide. We recommend extending that exemption to include built improvements as well. Likewise, we recommend exempting multifamily units with 3 or more bedrooms from both payments and construction for mitigation, with the goal of encouraging more multifamily units that are suitable for families with kids. Similarly, some uses are exempted fully from the LATR review process. Although they're exempted from LATR review, things like site access and circulation are still covered within county code. We recommend extending the current bioscience exemption for another 4 years, so that would go until 2029, January 2029. And we also recommend introducing a new exemption for daycares. We've seen daycares come in through the LATR process, and these studies can be a significant burden for this desired land use and business model that typically operates on thin margins. Also, many of the trips that daycares brings are typically pass-by trips, meaning that someone is already on the road. So when I take my kids to daycare, I'm like on my way to work, or I pick them up when I'm coming home from work. It's not a new trip on the network. It's just someone kind of making a detour on the way. So we recommend exempting daycare from the review requirements. The basics of the LATR process are in the growth and infrastructure policy, but all the technical details are spelled out in a separate document that we call the LATR guidelines. This document has had a series of iterative updates that have made it, well, rather unwieldy. And we recommend reorganizing and updating the guide so that it's clearer and more straightforward to use. Next recommendation is to clarify mutual expectations between the county and state highway administration. MDOT SHA reviews proposed development projects and provides really valuable feedback. We've heard from stakeholders that often the review timeline with state highway doesn't always align with does not align with the counties, and we also sometimes have different requirements and priorities, which makes resolving comments difficult. So we are recommending to clarify mutual expectations, particularly in red policy areas, and we'll do that within the text of the GIP where we can. In order to clarify our expectations for vehicle monitoring in red policy areas. And our last recommendation deals with impact taxes, which Lisa is going to go into detail on in just a minute. Today, developer-built improvements that enhance regional transportation capacity can receive credit against impact taxes. Other projects, such as many pedestrian and bike projects and improvements along state roads, are not eligible for credit. Our recommendation is to clarify in the code what is allowed credit, and then, if possible, to allow credit for more projects, including those along state roadways. We have heard concerns from some of our stakeholders about this, especially in terms of losing revenues from the county and understanding the difficulty of predicting such revenues. We're working on these recommendations and our other impact tax recommendations. We're working on them with the executive branch in the coming weeks to better understand the impact.
Thanks, Darcy. So I'm going to take us home. I'm going to go through impact tax recommendations, and then we'll talk about next steps and get to questions. So impact taxes, they're not necessarily part of the growth and infrastructure policy, but they are closely related. And for the 2020 growth and infrastructure policy, it focused on crafting an impact tax policy system that encourages the production of more housing and better aligns our impact tax policy with county priorities. while also balancing the needs of funding for our schools and transportation systems. And I want to emphasize the word balance there. The barometer of success for the GIP is not necessarily how much impact taxes we collect, but instead how the policy and its recommendations, including impact tax recommendations, can continue to advance county priorities while ensuring that our schools and transportation systems can also support new development. Next slide. I'm going to start by showing this graph of impact tax revenue that's been collected from 2012 to 2013. And I think what this chart does is it really highlights the unpredictable nature of impact tax revenue. It's often very cyclical. There's a lot of lows and a lot of highs. Impact tax collection, as you can imagine, is dependent on a lot of factors related to the cost of building housing. They are one part of the very complicated equation that determines if housing will be built or not. And planning staff we're sensitive to the importance of development provided transportation and school funding, but the county also pays a significant price when development projects do not advance or are pared down due to the county's high development costs. Impact taxes represent approximately 4% of the transportation capital budget and 7% of the school's budget, and they are an important revenue source for the county. While some proposed recommendations presented tonight may result in less impact taxes from specific projects, we think others may lead to increased revenues. And we just want to acknowledge the inherent difficulty that is involved with predicting revenue streams. So over the next couple of weeks, planning is going to work with the executive branch, the municipalities, and our stakeholders to better understand how the proposed recommendations in the GIP may impact revenue. So let's dive into the recommendations. Next slide. So currently impact taxes are charged on a per unit basis, and there's no distinction for unit size. And what that means is that you're building a detached house that's 5,000 square feet, it pays the same impact taxes as a 2,000 square foot detached home. And the county has really prioritized the production of smaller homes. We know that that's one way to provide more entry-level starter homes that are more affordable. So we're considering calculating residential impact taxes by a square foot instead of a per unit for attached and detached units. This is just one way that we're thinking about it, is using the median size of an attached structure to kind of set that 100% rate. And then if you were to build smaller than 2,500 square foot for attached, you would pay less, and more than 2,500 square foot for an attached unit, you would pay more. We're still working on the mechanics of that, but that's something we're working through right now. Next slide. And Hesu really, she gave a great preview for this recommendation. The planning department is currently reviewing the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative report. And what that will do is that it will eventually, hopefully, make it easier to build housing types that are beyond the typical single-family attached, detached, and multifamily structures. Relatedly, as she mentioned, 2/2s or stacked flats are becoming increasingly common in this county. In our zoning ordinance, it does classify 2/2s as multifamily low-rise structures, and they are multifamily low-rise for the calculation of student generation rates. However, the SGRs resemble the typical single family, more like a typical single family attached unit. And also, we also learned that the Department of Permitting Services charges them impact taxes as in the attached rate. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there that we need to figure out. So our recommendation is to really create a new impact tax category for housing types between single family attached and multifamily low. And this potential category could begin to be calculated using student generation data for 2/2s and stacked flats. Next slide. So currently projects that are in enterprise zones are exempt 100% from impact taxes. And the enterprise zone program, it designates areas of the state meeting certain requirements as targets for employment growth. Property tax credits are also available for businesses that hire new employees or invest in capital improvements. Currently, there's only 2 active current enterprise zones that are located in the county, Old Town Gaithersburg and Burtonsville, and both exemptions will expire by 2028. Our recommendation is to eliminate the current enterprise zone impact tax exemption. There's only 2 of them located in the county. And one of the feedback that we received related to this policy is there's just a lot of boundaries. And so, yes, as Jesus and Darcy mentioned, simplifying the school impact areas and transportation policies is a good way to start. But we think our impact tax recommendations can also help simplify the number of boundaries related to the policy. Next slide. So currently, projects in opportunity zones are exempt from impact taxes, and an opportunity zone is an economically distressed community where private investments may be eligible for capital gains tax incentives. This program requires state-nominated areas to be certified by the U.S. Treasury Department, and there's currently 14 census tracts in the county that have been certified as opportunity zone, and the designation remains for 10 years until 2028. This exemption does not apply to the city of Rockville. Our recommendation is to keep the opportunity zone exemption to support the county's economic development goals. And as the program will expire by 2028, we would add legacy or grandfathering language for projects that may have an approved application going forward where they were counting on this exemption but have not yet gone to building permit as the program expires in 2028. Next slide. In desired growth and investment areas, they include a specific Council of Governments designated activity centers and a 500-foot buffer around existing and specific planned bus rapid transit lines. And desired growth and investment areas, they give a 40% transportation impact tax discount for orange policy areas and a 32% discount for yellow policy areas. And this was a policy that came out of the 2020-2024 GIP update. We are recommending to remove this exemption as it's another boundary related to the GIP. And also we're keeping the opportunity zone exemption, and we're also changing the color classifications of several policy areas too. Next slide. So currently a three-bedroom multifamily dwelling unit in infill, a school's infill impact area pays impact taxes at 40% of the otherwise applicable rate. And the county has really prioritized building these types of units in the past, these design more family-friendly units, especially in high-rise buildings. We did a little digging, and since through CoStar and only around 929 three-bedroom units have been built since 2013, which is roughly around 4% of all rental units in that time. And we think this is another recommendation that can help better align the policy with Thrive. Thrive Montgomery 2050 recommends enacting policies that encourage the construction of housing units in multifamily buildings suitable for larger households. And this will help increase the amount and variety in housing in the county. And we're recommending to modify the exemption from the 40% discount to a full exemption of impact taxes for three-bedroom units in multifamily structures. Next slide. I think we probably all know that the county has a pretty high office vacancy rate, and converting office to residential is really difficult and really expensive. And currently, office to residential uses conversions, they get credited for their office use against their new residential impact taxes should they be converted. Our recommendation is, given how high the office vacancy rate is in the county and how expensive and difficult it is to convert, we would exempt office to residential conversions from impact taxes entirely. Next slide. And finally, the last impact tax recommendation has to do with bioscience. The county has exempted bioscience from paying impact taxes for nearly 20 years, but this is expiring on January 1st, 2025. So our recommendation is to extend that exemption until January 1st, 2029. And that wraps up the impact tax recommendations. So I'm just going to briefly talk about next steps. Next slide. So this is our project schedule. As you can see, we're in March. Last week, we briefed the planning board on our preliminary recommendations, and we're leading up into a May working draft posting and public hearing. We then will work with the planning board on the growth and infrastructure policy through the summer and transmit our draft to the county council by August 1st, and then they must adopt it by November 15th. Next slide. And then this is just a couple of upcoming milestones to put a date on it. As I said, in May 2nd, we're going to post the working draft. May 9th, we're going to brief the planning board on the working draft. And then on May 23rd, we're going to have a public hearing where we hope you all come out and give your thoughts on the growth and infrastructure policy update. And that's it.
Thank you, Lisa.
So we can do questions of either two ways. People could raise their hand. There's a raise their hand button, or people can put their questions in the chat and we can answer them.
I'll go ahead and read one from the chat. It was asking about, there was a statement that schools will use transportation boundaries, and ask for more of an explanation on that when we talk about school boundaries.
Sure. Do you want me to start, Jesus, and then you can fill in my gaps?
Sure.
Sure. So one of the great things about the data that we have when we're creating an index to create school impact areas is we can aggregate the data to any boundary that we want. So we have the number of housing units. They're all dots in our GIS system. We have the number of students and where they live. We have a bunch of other things that incorporated into the index, like the home sales data, and also pipeline and zoning and residential capacity. So what we're trying to do is simplify the number of boundaries related to the policy and create a new index for the policy this year that would use the transportation policy areas as boundaries. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Lisa explained it well. I guess the one thing that we didn't do last time around when we were introducing the school impact area boundaries, where we were only focused on our own data set. So we didn't even try to cooperate with the transportation boundaries. So we just created, I mean, there might be slivers of areas where there, one area in the transportation area boundary, but then cut off from that area from the transportation boundary and placed into a different boundary on the school impact area site. So we're trying to minimize those types of things. So like if you're in one boundary, in one area for the transportation policy purposes, you'll be grouped in the same area for school impact areas as well. Doesn't mean the school impact areas will align exactly with how transportation areas are classified. We're just using the same boundaries and then doing our own analysis again to decide which will fall under what.
We're still doing, like Casey said, we're still going to do that deep data dive that we did last time, just using different boundaries this time. No one has any other questions?
There was a question asking if next time we could overlay. So on the tax, on this slide, if next time we could overlay the number of permits that were issued, so you can tell whether it's the rates or whether it's.
That's a good point. We have the building permit. We have cleaned up building permit data from Department of Permitting since 2020, and that perfectly aligns with the last GIP update. So we can certainly do that. That's a great idea.
You've been any other questions? You can put either in the chat or you can raise your hand. So I guess, are there other priorities that that we didn't mention that you think that we should be addressing in this policy? Okay, well, we're not going to make everyone. Oh, here we go. We got a question. Yes. Can we talk a little more about upgrading Rock Spring to a red area? Yes. Let me go back. That map. Here's the map with Rock Spring. So this recommendation is based on the vision for Rock Spring in the master plan, as well as its existing transit service that it has with the bus transit center there, as well as planned premium transit. It's also importantly in the complete street design guide and master plan of highways and transitways, it is set as a downtown area. So that's one of the ways we looked for additional activity centers that would be appropriate as red policy areas. Obviously, just changing something red on the map doesn't change, what's on the ground today. But the idea is that by giving it this designation and signaling the type of development we're expecting there and that we're looking for there, it will help encourage that kind of development to come in as well. Our next question is, by pinning impact taxes to square footage, does that open the door to tax additions and renovations?
I don't know the answer. I don't think so. I think so. I think you're only assessed an impact tax on a new residential unit and not addition. So I don't think it will have an impact.
Yeah, commercial additions commercial additions you do pay an impact tax, but I don't think that's what we were envisioning with this recommendation. Wasn't about additions and renovations, which are already guided by, a different part of the code. But excellent question.
We can give it till 7:05, and I'm happy to stay here
Mm-hmm.
a little bit later if anyone thinks of a question.
Yep. Yeah, we're happy to stay on and have a conversation. I think also, I'm going to find our contact information. We not have it on this, Chris? Don't have it, but you can contact me, Darcy Buckley, DARCY BUCKLEY at montgomeryplanning.org, and also put it in the chat. And we will definitely post the presentation. We posted on the website, which Kayla, would you mind putting the GIP website in the chat?
And also our emails are attached to the RSVP email
Thank
that
you.
We sent out earlier. We got another question. Has planning staff considered the taxing district proposals being now circulated? We've been following them, but I don't think that we have really considered them at this point, given I think there's still a lot up in the air with the state legislation, but we are we're hoping to learn more about that.
Great, and Kayla put a link to the to a resource page, where we're posting, we'll post our slide presentations, or we'll post this presentation, but we can also send it out to the people who attended, so you don't have to go
Right.
looking for it.
And one other thing is, for the impact tax recommendations, we only included recommendations tonight of things that we changed. There are recommendations that we are holding over from the 2020 growth and infrastructure policy, like we're calculating impact taxes at the 100% the cost per student seat, that are in our full presentation to the planning board last Thursday, but we just didn't, for the sake of time tonight, so we weren't here for 2 hours, we didn't include those tonight.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for spending Tuesday evening with us.
Thank you so much. And please
Have a
don't
good
hesitate
evening.
to reach out if you have any
Yep.
questions.